Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite movies, Highlander. There Can Be Only One. So, Highlander is a movie that came out in 1986, and it was directed by Russell Mulcahy, and it was written by three credited screenwriters: Gregory Wyden, um, Peter Bellwood, and Larry Ferguson, with Gregory Wyden getting the lion's share done for the final product. And so Highlander is one of my, not only one of my favorite movies, but also one of my favorite 80s fantasy movies. And I would even throw it into the group of sort of adult geared fantasy movies, such as Ridley Scott's Legend, John Borman's Excalibur, and John Milius's Conan the Barbarian. All very different movies, mind you, but the fact that this movie kind of joins that group in terms of, say, blazing a new trail or cutting new ground for fantasy and world building. That's nothing to sneeze at. And Highlander has, throughout the years, proven to be very iconic and very influential within, say, the realm of storytelling, as well as world building and film technique. And a part of the reason why it's been so influential and iconic is because, frankly, it's one of those lightning in the bottle types of movies, in the sense that everything ultimately came together in such a way to where attempts to repeat this movie's success have been wanting, or I should say been found wanting, whereas this movie, the original, has in a lot of ways, I think, stood the test of time. Now granted, because it was made in the 80s, you kind of have to accept the fact that things such as special effects are somewhat dated, but at the same time, if you can bear that in mind, this is a great movie, and I think it played a part in launching the careers of a lot of people. First and foremost is Christopher Lambert, who prior to this movie, he was mainly known as a French cinema star, and he had quite a following amongst that audience. And unfortunately, I don't believe I've seen any of his French movies. I know he was in Luc Besson's Subway, which I heard was supposed to be pretty good, but I haven't seen that. But that's definitely something that's on my list to check out. But then I believe his first American movie was Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, which was a fantastic movie, a depressing movie, but a fantastic one. And so, following that up, he got the lead role as Connor MacLeod in this movie. And, this is something that I think it's one of those movies that, he's always going to be remembered for. He's always going to be remembered as, the main dude from Highlander. He's always going to be remembered as Connor MacLeod. And granted, you could argue that, he's not the best actor in the world when it comes to, say, English language movies. But at the same time, though, you go back to that lightning in a bottle effect, and he was perfect for this part. And sometimes that's just how it works out. You have an actor who, maybe they're not, the greatest when it comes to, say, multiple projects, but they'll have that one role in which they'll say, okay, that person may not be the best actor in the world, but they were great in that movie. And not to say that Christopher Lambert hasn't been in any other good movies, but this is definitely the role that he's most recognized for. And thankfully it's something that he takes a lot of pride in, because I think he recognizes that this was a fantastic movie, and it has a worldwide audience that loves this movie to this day, and a lot of people are still discovering it for the first time. So that's pretty cool, nothing to sneeze at. And also you have the director, Russell Mulcahy. Now, to be fair, Russell Mulcahy had already had an extensive career in the world of music videos. In fact, he had done a lot of pioneering work for that medium. And amongst other things, he had also directed the very first music video for MTV, which was Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, which is a good song, and a good music video. So if you haven't heard the song or seen the video, check it out. But besides that, though, Russell Mulcahy had also done a ton of work with Duran Duran, Elton John, Rod Stewart, Human League, Billy Joel, and so the guy. I mean, he was a professional. I mean, he knew how to do cinematic style work for films that were, say, only a few minutes long. And so when he got the opportunity to do his very first theatrical movie, which was a really cool movie called Razorback, which I have also reviewed, and I'll gladly put the link to that in my description here. You watch Razorback, which was kind of an Australian environmental horror film. You watch that movie, and then you watch his work on music videos, or like just look up some of the stuff he's done for music videos, then watch Razorback, and you could definitely see how his time and technique when it came to, say, doing music videos carried over into the world of theatrical movies. And so he continued that the stuff that he did with Razorback and brought it on over to Highlander and even refined it, I would say. And so while Highlander is something that is definitely a highlight in Russell Mulcahy's career, unfortunately, while he's made some other decent to good movies, he hasn't really been able to recapture that lightning in a bottle type of success that he had with Highlander, because while he did a ton of other music videos, which is something that he was definitely good at, the very next theatrical movie he did was Highlander 2, and ironically, it's probably one of the worst movies ever made, and also one of the worst sequels ever made, to one of the best movies ever made, at least in terms of fantasy movies. And so, unfortunately, while you had a movie that kind of made Russell Mulcahy's career in terms of theatrical work, or cinematic work, I should say. You also have his very next movie being something that sort of damaged his career, unfortunately, and also kind of damaged I guess you could say the legacy of Highlander. And so it wasn't really until they did a TV series in the 90s that the world building and storytelling of Highlander sort of began to get fixed and repaired. And so the TV series of Highlander, I honestly I was too young, I think, to watch it at the time, or at the very least too young to fully appreciate it. But I do remember, say, like my parents watched it a little bit, and my grandparents watched it a lot, and they really liked it. But I remember that Adrian Paul was the main actor in that TV show, and he played I don't know if he was a descendant of Connor MacLeod, or if he was just like a fellow family member of Connor MacLeod, because he played someone named Duncan MacLeod. But the fact is, Adrian Paul's character was related to Christopher Lambert's character, and so he was the main character in the TV show. And so by all accounts, the TV show was actually pretty good, especially for the 90s. But in terms of the theatrical sequels to Highlander, they unfortunately were found very wanting. But another career that was launched was that of Clancy Brown. Now, that's not to say that this was Clancy Brown's first movie, but this was the first movie that really put him on the map in terms of people seeing him as someone in an iconic role. Because he plays the villain Kurgan. And so you look at your 80s movies, especially like 80s fantasy movies, you have Highlander, which is an adult-oriented 80s fantasy movie, and which kind of goes between old school fantasy movies, and also urban fantasy movies. And you have the villain Kurgan, as played by Clancy Brown, being someone who is at home both, say, hundreds of years ago, as well as, in the then present day of the 80s. And, he was, probably one of the most iconic, villains of, 80s fantasy films. And so, you see him in this movie, and then you see him in things like Shawshank Redemption or Starship Troopers. And, the guy, was fantastic in this movie, and he stole every scene he was in. And so, and also, I think another thing that happened was, while Michael Kamen, did the score for this movie, you had the band Queen doing the songs for this movie. And there are so many songs in this, that they did for this movie that have become iconic in their own right, mainly because of their involvement in this movie. So Queen was already a popular band, but their involvement with this movie increased their popularity, and it also brought some star power to this movie. And so basically, just a whole bunch of careers were either launched or enhanced by being involved with Highlander. And so, yeah, I'm sorry. I should probably get to the story now, but I just wanted to give you all kind of an introduction as far as the legacy of Highlander, and you could argue that there's a little bit of science fiction involved in a sense of immortality, but it's definitely more fantasy than science fiction. Although Highlander has popped up, in the realm of science fiction in terms of reviews from time to time, but it's definitely, I would consider it, straight up, fantasy as opposed to science fiction. Okay, so the story of Highlander, it centers on the character of Connor MacLeod, as played by Christopher Lambert, who is an immortal who's been around since the 1500s, and he has lived to the present day of the 1980s, and he is a part of a dwindling group of immortals who have been fighting each other or just trying to survive throughout time until, say, the last few of them are called on sort of a mental and spiritual level to gather in one place for a final battle. And this final battle is fittingly called the Gathering. And so these immortals that Connor MacLeod is a part of, the only way that they can die is if their head is separated from their body. So basically you have to cut their heads off in order to kill them. You can shoot them, you can stab them, you can beat them, but they'll just heal and keep on going unless you cut their heads off. And so Connor MacLeod, I mean, he's someone who ever since he first died in battle a long time ago, he's basically walked the earth, picking up skills, learning from others like himself, as well as building a new life for himself multiple times throughout his existence, because unfortunately you can't stay the same person for hundreds of years without people pointing at you and saying something's wrong with this guy, why is he never aging, that kind of thing. And so basically he's made a new life for himself multiple points throughout his existence. And so coming into the present day, the film starts off wherein he's in a parking garage leaving a wrestling match, and he's accosted by a fellow immortal. And while he tries to talk the guy out of fighting him, this other dude is like, no, I'm taking your head. And so Connor is like, all right. And so the two of them have a really intense fight, which ultimately ends in Connor taking the dude's head. And when that happens, he gets something called the quickening, which is basically where the victor of combat basically gets the essence of the loser, like all their skills and memories and what have you. So going forward, they have a new skill set added to their own. And so unfortunately though, right after he's killed this guy, the police capture him, because they spot him, acting suspiciously and fleeing the scene, and so he's taken to the precinct and interrogated, but he's able to basically kind of intimidate slash talk his way out of the interrogation room. And since they don't have anything to hold him on, all they can do is say, don't go anywhere. And so they've got a couple of people keeping an eye on him. But another person that gets involved in the story is a forensic specialist named Brenda Wyatt, who finds some rather interesting things at the crime scene. So besides the fact that there's a man who's had his head cut off, she also finds metal fragments from a sword that arguably shouldn't even exist. And so she starts to do some investigation, and she finds out that not only is Connor MacLeod an antique dealer, but he has his own history with swords as well. And so she kind of puts two and two together and realizes that there's something very strange going on, in the sense that he's tied to this crime scene, but she doesn't know how or why. And obviously Connor, he's not too forthcoming with any information. In fact, he tells her to hey, stay away from this, back off. And so it's good advice, really, because at this point he's actually being hunted by an old enemy of his, a fellow immortal by the name of the Kurgan, as played by Clancy Brown. And Kurgan is an immortal who's been around for a long time, and he's described as the oldest and strongest of the immortals, at least at the point in the movie that he's introduced. And he's one of the last few remaining immortals left. And he's making his way to New York, where the gathering is. I mean, that's where the few remaining immortals are being drawn to, is New York City. And so it turns out that Kurgan is the one who is responsible for Connor MacLeod's first death, and thus him becoming immortal, all those years ago, way back in the 1500s. And the only reason that the Kurgan wasn't able to take Connor's head back then is because he was attacked in battle. Because he was actually Connor was with his family, the MacLeods, in Scotland, and they were having a dispute with another clan called the Frasers. And the Kurgan had sensed that there was another immortal that was in the area, and that immortal being Connor MacLeod. Except he also realized that Connor was at this point was unaware of his immortality, of his true nature. Like, as far as Connor knew, he was just an ordinary young chap. And so when the battles joined, the MacLeods, they ultimately end up being victorious against the Frasers, but not before Kurgan meets Connor on the field of battle. And he had told the Frasers that he's offering his services to them, but on the condition that Connor MacLeod is his. No one touches him. And so while Connor, in this, in the past, was trying to, find someone to fight him in battle, because, this is his first full-on battle he's ever been in. All his opponents that he's trying to fight, or once they see him, they're like, no, not him. And so they go to fight someone else. And he's like, what the hell's going on here? And then next thing he knows, he's ambushed by this really large, imposing, menacing looking Hulk of a character who demands to fight him. And so he's totally outmatched by Kurgan and mortally wounded by him. And Kurgan's about to take his head when some of his kinsmen, some of Connor's kinsmen, they attack Kurgan and drive him away. And so Connor dies that night, only to awaken the next morning with his wound fully healed. And so when the people, when his kinsmen see this, rather than being, happy about this miracle, they consider it a sign of witchcraft, that Connor's in league with the devil. And so, while one of his, kinsmen tries to warn him away, basically saying, the guy's name was Angus. While Angus is one of the few people in the village that tries to warn him away, everyone else tries to kill him, and they beat the crap out of him, and they're about to try and burn him before Angus, forcefully restrains the crowd, and defends Connor from them, and tells them that there'll be no burning, we'll just banish him. And so, as Connor's leaving, he looks back and, he's, telling Angus that he'll always remember this kindness. And so Connor, from then on, basically wanders the land, building a new life for himself. And, and so the movie goes back and forth between the present day and then the past, where, Connor's, trying to learn more about, what happened to him. And that's when, when he's building a new life for himself, he, has a wife named Heather who, she knows that there's something different about him, but at the same time, she does love him. And so the two of them have a good life together. And that's when they meet a man named Ramirez, played by the late, great Sean Connery. And Ramirez is, an immortal who has been around for at least 1,000 years, I believe. And he's basically an Egyptian who, at this point in time, is living as a Spaniard. And he's actually, come, to Scotland looking for Connor specifically, because, while it's coming from Ramirez, that Connor is able to learn about, his fellow immortals, and he, has, the first true friend other than his wife Heather that, he's had in a long time. And so Ramirez, basically takes on this mentor role, and he explains to him the nature of, the immortals. And he even, although he does admit that, when he has no idea why they are the way they are, and because Connor is asking, why are we immortal? How, what determines, who becomes immortal? And so Ramirez is saying, who knows? I mean, are the stars at night just pinpricks in the sky? And so basically, the point is, Ramirez, he doesn't know why they are the way they are. He doesn't know why certain people are, basically called to immortality or become immortal. All he knows is that they are, and that, the only way they can die is by beheading. And so, while some immortals, basically try to, hide out and live their lives, to some extent, free of interference, others, try to, basically, go after their fellow immortals and take their heads and, claim their, essences, their life force, as it were, their skill sets. And so, it's from Ramirez that Connor learns about the quickening, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning, what happens when, one immortal beheads another. They get their essence, their skill sets, their memories and what have you. And so, it's almost like a form of cannibalism in a way, or a spiritual form of cannibalism, if you will. And so Ramirez, though, is one of those immortals who, while he's aware that, eventually there is going to be a time called the Gathering, wherein, the last few remaining immortals will be drawn to a faraway land and be forced to fight one another until only one remains. For the period of time that he's alive, Ramirez has taken it upon himself, to try and, help and mentor, fellow immortals, especially ones who have the potential for, to, carry out a lot of good in the world. And he sees that in Connor. And so, even though, theoretically speaking, Ramirez should be trying to take Connor's head and vice versa, the two of them become really good friends. And Ramirez, teaches Connor, everything he knows as far as, say, like sword play and training and what have you. And so, unfortunately, though, Ramirez was murdered by Kurgan, when Kurgan came back looking for Connor, to, take his head after all these years. And so Ramirez, he puts up a good fight, but unfortunately, Kurgan is just too strong. And so while, Ramirez got some hits in on him, Kurgan ultimately ends up, wounding him severely and then taking his head and raping Heather, Connor's wife, which Connor doesn't find out about until years later. I mean, we're talking like hundreds of years later, which is something that really galvanizes him into action against Kurgan. But back to the present day. I know there's like a lot of flip-flopping here, but in the present day, though, Connor is basically, Connor at this point, he's already in New York City. I mean, he's made a life for himself there. And he goes by the name of Russell Nash, and he's an antique dealer. And so, he's able to put his, acquisitions to good use and, build a lucrative life for himself. But at the same time, he also knows that, the time of the gathering is here. And so, he, on one hand, he's looking forward to it in the sense that there's all this anticipation that all the immortals feel, or I should say the remaining immortals feel. But at the same time, though, he's dreading it because he knows that there's a possibility that amongst these fellow immortals, there might be a friend or two that he ultimately will end up having to fight. But in the meantime, though, the police are still looking at him, and Brenda Wyatt, the forensic specialist, she gets further involved in the story, wherein she does, works with some other people and does some detective work in the police department. And, this one friend of hers, he's able to, compare hand signatures over the years, that, Russell Nash had to, and he's able to compare them to other, people, throughout the years. And so basically, he's able to show her that these signatures are a match. But mind you, not only are these signatures, the names of different people, but they're the names of different people, throughout hundreds of years. And so, not only is this, this one, specialist freaked out, but Brenda's freaked out too, because, not only are there, people running around the city, going after each other with swords, and also, there's, this hulking menace of a dude that's going after this guy that she's trying to follow, but she realizes that she stumbled on something that she didn't even know exists, like a shadow world or something. And so Connor reluctantly starts to open up to her, and he also allows himself to actually feel a connection with a fellow human. Because one of the things that happened, a long time ago was, he came to realize that one of the downsides of being immortal is you outlive your loved ones. And so when, one of his loved ones passed away due to old age, he basically, refused to, get, I guess you could say, involved in someone in the sense that, beyond, say, just quick, pursuit of pleasure, he is basically, cut himself off, from being happy with, say, another woman, that kind of thing. And so, he and Brenda, they start to, build a connection with one another, like even before, she realizes that this guy's, an immortal, there was already some sort of awkward, attraction between the two. But on the other hand, though, you've got, the Kurgan who's, making his way through, the remaining immortals until, inevitably it's going to be, Connor and Kurgan, facing one another for the prize. and no one at this point knows what the prize is. All they know is that it's, basically the end result of the final battle of the gathering. And it's what everything's been building to all these, hundreds and thousands of years. And so, yeah, yeah, this was a really, fascinating movie, and a really cool one too, because, amongst other things, it really, allows one to think about what it would be like to, say, be an immortal in the way that it's portrayed in this movie. I mean, you know, what would it be like to, say, live throughout, all these lifetimes, to see all these, wondrous and tragic events throughout history? What would it be like having to, say, reinvent yourself, every hundred years or so, just so, other people, don't start to get suspicious, that kind of thing? Or what would it be like to, still look like you did when you first died, but to, say, outlive, your loved friends and loved ones? And I mean, it's really fascinating in that regard. But also, one of the things that was really cool about this movie is the fact that because it was made when it was in the 80s, there was a certain gritty aesthetic, that brought a lot of authenticity to it. Like, it looked like the grimy, New York, city underworld, that I'm guessing New York City was at the time. I've never been to New York City. I don't know. I know that, it wasn't always, I mean, for a long period of time, it was kind of like, urban hell, but then, it started to improve, but nowadays I hear it's not so good anymore, but back in the 80s, though, I mean, it's like you get a snapshot of a time of what New York City was actually like. Now, granted, this is, in an urban fantasy movie, but at the same time, it looks and feels authentic. Like the people, the places, it all just, it looks and feels like, this fantastical story is taking place in the real world, that kind of thing. And another thing is, even though there is, the fantastical element of immortality, and there are, some crazy special effects, and I say crazy in a good way, like in terms of, say, whenever the quickening happens, there's like a lot of, crazy, lightning that, goes all over the place, and then, the victor, gets, the loser's essence and what have you. Even though you've got that going on, for the most part, that element, it's somewhat subdued, except when in the moments when it's actually happening, because, the immortals that get some level of focus, they feel like real people that just happen to be immortal, and even say the character of Kurgan, as played by Clancy Brown. I mean, basically, he's like a man of his time. I mean, he's, a cold-hearted, bloodthirsty warrior who has, made it, throughout multiple lifetimes. And while he's able to adapt, to, society to some degree, I mean, he's still, a nomadic warrior at heart. And, basically, any element of, say, corruption or any sort of underworld element, he blends in, with it seamlessly. So you come to the present day, he looks like a hulking, crowd member of, a heavy metal band. But at this point in time, it's not out of place at all, because this is the 80s, but he still looks very intimidating. And then, of course, you have, Connor MacLeod, who, because, he was a good-hearted individual to start off with, and he also had the good fortune of being mentored by a fellow immortal who had, the well-being of other immortals in mind. I mean, Connor was able to, live, for a long period of time, and he was able to, learn from multiple life experiences and continually reinvent himself, to where he's living a stable life, aside from having to look over his shoulder for fellow immortals, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the glimpses that we get of a couple of other immortals sort of go along with the whole, they more or less are ordinary people that just happen to be immortal, that kind of thing. Like, other than Kurgan, no one really looks outlandish. And, they look like you could argue that Sean Connery's character Ramirez looks outlandish, but that's because he dresses in the type of attire that was common for, I guess you could say, Spaniards at that point in time, that kind of thing. But in terms of, say, looking physically outlandish, Kurgan definitely takes the prize. But basically he's embracing the chaos, so his outlandish appearance makes some level of sense. Whereas the other immortals that we see, or I should say the few immortals that we see, they just look like ordinary people, but when the time comes for them to, draw their swords and put up a fight, the game's on, But this was just, a very, fascinating movie, because, it does make you think, and there's so much about this world that we don't know. And, I've talked with people like my dad and a couple of friends of mine about, yes, we know it's just a movie, it's a cool fantasy story, but at the same time, with so much that we don't know about the world, what if there were immortals that were walking the earth who had been around for hundreds of years? What would it be like to talk to them, that kind of thing? What stories would they have to tell? And now, granted, because this is Connor's story, the stories that are told are coming from his perspective, but we kind of get a glimpse of other stories outside of that. But like, there's this really cool scene where, he's going on a date with Brenda for a first time, and he opens this bottle. I think it's a brandy, maybe, but it was from I forgot what year it was, but it was from like the late 1700s, and he's sniffing it, and he just get this faraway look in his eyes, and he's closing them, and he's thinking, and he's telling her all the things that happened in that year, and you could tell that just from his dialogue that he was actually there when these things happened, whereas Brenda, she's just like, that's some pretty good historical knowledge, and he's like, oh yeah, of course, it's that kind of thing. But it's a nice little moment, though. And also, there's also a really funny scene where he meets a fellow immortal, a guy by the name of Castigear, played by Hugh Quarshie, in a very small part, but still it kind of adds to the whole idea of world building. And he and Castigear, they actually knew each other from a while back, from the 1700s, I believe, and they're reminiscing about the last time they were at a party together, and it ended up resulting in Connor getting into a drunken duel with a noble for having unfortunately insulted the guy's wife. And so you have this really hilarious flashback where Connor, he's got this powdered wig on, and he's on the Boston Commons, and he's trying to he's hungover, he's plastered as shit, and the wig keeps on falling over his face, and the nobleman who's wanting to fight him is like, sir, and so finally he gets his sword up, and he turns around and the fight starts, but he just keeps getting stabbed by the guy multiple times. And it's like the first time the nobleman's like, one and done, but then Connor, being the immortal that he is, or I should say in this case the drunken immortal at this moment, he gets up and he's all like, what? And so everyone's like, you missed. He's like, no, I didn't. Okay. And he stabs Connor again, and this happens multiple times. And so finally, Connor, he gets so annoyed at all this, and finally, he tells the guy, he's like, hey, look, you win, okay? I apologize for calling your wife a bloated warthog. I bid you good day. And he staggers off to, recover from his hangover, and everyone's just like, what the hell just happened, And so So I like how you do have these glimpses of past lives that this fascinating character has had, and so it's really cool in that regard. And like I said, I like how the few immortals that we do see are portrayed in such a way to where it's like, I mean, we remember them, even whether they're bit players or important characters and what have you. But I also liked how you have the subplot of ordinary humans, or mortals I should say, starting to discover that there's a race of immortals living amongst them, in plain sight, or I should say hiding in plain sight. I mean, you have the subplot of Brenda you know working with that other specialist in the police department, and the two of them having, there's that really cool moment where they both kind of freak out when they realize that Russell Nash's signature matches with all these other people's signatures throughout hundreds of years. I mean, you have that awesome moment, and the acting on both of their parts in that moment is like, that's, I mean, all things considered, that actually feels like something that's probably how they would react if this was a real situation, that kind of thing. And you also have, this really awesome moment where, I mean, this kind of goes into the whole bit of, ordinary people, finding out about immortals kind of the hard way. But when, Kurgan, is going up against another immortal, during the night, at one point, there's this one, I think he was like a Vietnam veteran or something, who's driving around the city. He's also kind of a gun nut, and you get the idea that he's someone who, this bit part dude, he's someone who's kind of going crazy from his experience in Vietnam or something like that. And because he's going around, he's got all these guns in his car, and then he stumbles upon this, on these two dudes fighting each other with swords in an alley, and he's like, what the hell? And so, I mean, he's crazy, but he knows that this is crazy too, and so he goes right towards it, so sort of going side to side, military style, one spot to another, checking the corners and everything, and he cocks his gun, and he screams out, what's going on? And unfortunately, though, it's right at that point that Kurgan cuts the other dude's head off. And so when that happens, this gun nut just empties his machine gun into Kurgan's body. But unfortunately, all that does is piss the dude off, and he gets like a foot of steel rammed through his belly for his trouble. But the guy survives, which, I mean, you're like, how the hell did he survive that? But at the same time, it's kind of badass, showing how hardcore this guy was. And he's actually able to, give the police some information about what's going on. And so I like how they played the scene, because like he's in the hospital and everything, and he's telling them what happened, and he's, telling them, what this big dude looked like. But on the other hand, though, when he starts telling them about, all this crazy lightning that started flashing out, all these explosions, you don't hear what he's saying, but it's like, there's this, it shows him, and he's covered by, the window of his hospital room, and you see him, just, gesturing and telling, the detectives what happened. And, it's a really intense moment, and the detectives, they're like, okay. And so they leave the room, and they're all like, okay, put out flyers, for with this description, as well as get a sketch artist in there, but don't say anything about flashing lights or anything like that. So I liked how the police are trying to do their job in this story, but at the same time, there are limits to the type of craziness that they'll take seriously, that kind of thing. Like they know that there's there's some head-hunting serial killer going around, at least they think there is, but at the same time they're not quite ready to believe in immortals as of yet, that kind of thing. So it was fascinating, seeing, the perspective of ordinary people when it came to their interactions with immortals. And so, another thing about this movie was the soundtrack. You had, Michael Kamen, doing a fantastic score for the movie. It was grandiose, epic, tragic, all the above, and it's like it really fits the movie. And I liked how, like when the movies say like in the 1500s, it sounds like something you'd imagine from the 1500s, like in the Scottish Highlands. But then of course you go to the present, and there's still that sort of epic score, but it's a little more menacing, because of the gritty urban environment. And so I thought that was actually, pretty cool how they managed to do that with the music. But also you have, the songs by Queen. And this was already an awesome movie, but the songs by Queen just pumped it up even more. And the funny thing is, one of the things I found out, through listening to the commentary and reading up on some stuff about the movie, was that Queen originally they were approached just to do one song for the movie, and so the movie was screened for them. And of course, their music wasn't in the movie yet because they hadn't done the music for the movie yet. But they liked the movie so much that they were like, "Hey, we'll do more songs for this," and so. Boom, there you go. And so you had, Princes of the Universe, A Kind of Magic. Let's see. I think it was 1 Year of Love. And then, Hammer to Fall. It just really, they did some, really good music. Oh yeah, Give Me the Prize, Kurgan song, badass. And of course, the brief snippet of, New York, New York. Unfortunately, it only exists as a snippet, but in the scene where it's taking place, basically where Kurgan, Kurgan is, driving, at 1 billion miles an hour, the wrong way down the street, and just causing all sorts of havoc and not having a care in the world. And this is all at night. You have this pounding, score, and it's amazing. And then of course, you have him start singing, Frank Sinatra's New York, New York, and then it cuts to Freddie Mercury, singing New York, New York, and that vocal part is only for a few moments, but that scene is amazing. Okay, and so it's one of those things where it's like everything just kind of works perfectly. And also in terms of scene transition, that's definitely something that you could tell that because of Russell Mulcahy's experience with music videos, that's definitely something you can see carrying over into Highlander in his work and how they did this movie, because you see the scene transitions and photography. Like you see, there's this one moment where, in the past, you see Connor, sort of, looking out into the distance, and it sort of, dissolves into, say, a sort of graffiti portrait of the Mona Lisa. And it was just a nice little visual, to where it's like, okay, and finding out that Russell Mulcahy had done all this music video work, it's like, yeah, I could definitely see that. And also when it came to, say, like the fight scenes, they were badass. And some people are, nitpick or are saying, those fight scenes are so lame, because they're so used to things like, say, Game of Thrones and what have you. Nothing against Game of Thrones, but because this was made in the 80s, I guess, expectations were different. But once again, that's not a problem, at least not for me. Personally, I thought the fights were badass, and I thought that in a lot of ways, the fight scenes that we got said a lot about, the characters that were involved in the fights. But also, like, whenever two immortals are fighting each other, and they're doing a lot of damage not only to each other but to all this property around them. You're talking like cutting into sides of buildings and causing sparks to fly out and things like that, or bringing buildings down, or getting electrocuted and not giving a shit, that kind of thing. It's some pretty badass scenery as far as combat goes, and also just one of the things that I guess I'll just say I further appreciate is the fact that because there wasn't all, and this was before CGI was running rampant. The fight scenes look and feel authentic, and it's like, yeah, I'm sure you could. I'm sure there might have been a scene or two where there may have been a stunt person or what have you, but the point is you had real people, and for the most part it was the actual actors doing the fighting and what have you with the swords, and so that definitely added to the feel of authenticity that this sort of gritty urban environment had, as well as, say, the Scottish Highlands of the 1500s. And another thing I was going to say is that the production, values for this movie are very well done, because when it's flashing back to the 1500s, like, I'm not a history major or anything like that, but from pictures I've seen from stuff of that time period, they did a very good job of recreating a lot of stuff that was common for back then, and it looked like ancient times, and so it really adds to this almost timeless feel. And then you fast forward to the 80s, and okay, you're going to say, yes, it's the 80s, it's dated, okay, that's true, but it looks authentic. Like, it looks like it was filmed and set in the 80s when it's in the present day, which it was. so yeah, it's like, whether it's in the past or the present, I mean, this film looks great. I mean, the environment looks real, and it's just fantastic stuff. And okay, so the acting, I feel like I've already sang a lot of the praises of the actors, but I mean, okay, so Christopher Lambert, I mean, he owned his role as Connor MacLeod. And the funny thing is, he really didn't speak a lot of English before he did this movie. He had to work with a dialogue coach. And so there's a funny, line where when he's being interrogated, someone's saying, "Oh, you got a funny accent. Where are you from?" And so he says, "Lots of different places." And so, that was kind of you feel like it was kind of like an inside joke in the sense that, because he didn't speak English very well, he was going to have a strange sounding voice when he did try to speak English. And so because, Connor MacLeod had been around for as long as he had and had been all over the world, it made sense that his voice would have traces of multiple accents. And so I thought that was actually a nice touch. And also, Christopher Lambert, I forgot what the condition was called, but in real life, he has this visual defect or basically, I think it's like he's almost blind. I could be mistaken about that, but basically he's got this very intense stare that even whether you like him or not, it's like that guy has an intense stare. Okay, but it actually works for the character, and considering the nature of his character, because you have moments where he's happy and everything, and he's so blasted likable in those moments, like when you see him like with his family and friends, of course, before they drive him away because he's immortal, but like when you see him with his wife Heather, or when he's becoming friends with Ramirez, I mean, when he's hanging out with Castigier, I mean, it's like you see this guy who hasn't been able to let his guard down for a long time, but in these moments though he's able to relax and pretend to be an ordinary human, that kind of thing, and just kind of enjoy life. And Christopher Lambert, on the stuff I've seen him in, he, whether it's a good movie or a bad movie, like whenever he's joyful about something, it feels authentic, and that's definitely something that holds true with Highlander. But for the most part, though, you get the idea that he's a guy who, for the most part, is on edge and on guard because he has to be. because he never knows when someone's going to be coming for his head, or whenever someone's going to be, digging into his past, trying to find out the truth about him, that kind of thing. So Christopher Lambert, I think, did a really good job in playing that part, in the sense of, someone who is intense, but he doesn't necessarily want to be intense. And so it's like when those moments come where he's able to relax, it's like a relief, that kind of thing. But when he's brings his, anger and A game to the table, look out, because he owns the intensity, in those scenes. And the fight choreography, that he was able to pick up, for the movie, was actually very well done too. And, a couple of people pointed out that, with the visual problem he had, I mean, it's possible that he was more or less fighting blind. And if that's the case, I mean, if that's true, that's scary, but that's badass too, because you look at him on screen and it's like, damn, this guy's actually pretty good. And then, of course, you have Roxanne Hart. I had to double check her name. Roxanne Hart, she plays the forensic specialist, Brenda Wyatt, the one who starts to, you get clues as to, who, Connor or Russell Nash really is. And, she actually does a really good job too. And sometimes in movies like this, love interest can be kind of a plot tumor, but this was something that I felt like, because it wasn't automatically a love interest, but something that gradually became one, it actually helped the movie. And also, because she was an ordinary human, it sort of gave the audience, sort of a window into what it was like, to, try and, to one, not only stumble upon the existence of, a race of immortals, but, two, trying to, relate with one of them, that kind of thing. And also, I liked, the camaraderie that she had, with her coworkers in the police department, and so any of the scenes with the detectives and what have you, I thought were very well done. And, especially, let's see here, like, there was a character actor named Alan North who, he played a guy named Lieutenant Moran. He was the guy who was kind of, in charge of, the investigation and what have you. But I've seen him in some stuff too. But like he, really did a good job too. And it was a comparatively minor supporting role. But I was just pointing out though that it's like you have character actors in the right parts, and you have some very believable people in the movie. And so Roxanne Hart, when she's playing off of these fellow supporting actors, it actually feels like, hey, ordinary people, doing their jobs, that kind of thing. And also, her chemistry with Christopher Lambert was actually pretty good too, because you go from, cautious and on edge, because there's this weird, guy following her, because she's following him, to, hey, she's actually starting to, become intrigued by him, because, she's finding out about all this immortal stuff. And then by the time they do become lovers, it's like, okay, that actually, it kind of makes sense, and then of course, you have Clancy Brown, who, as I mentioned earlier, steals, just about every scene he's in. And I mean, Clancy Brown was already an intimidating looking dude, but they made him look terrifying in this movie, just on a purely physical level. And he's one of those bad guys who, I mean, he's straight up evil, okay? Make no mistake. And yet, he's having a blast, because he can be intimidating and yet, in a very dark way, perversely likable too. Because it's like you have a lot of quotable dialogue from him, and also just this whole devil may care attitude. And for his character, that actually makes sense. And I remember, though, it's like, the theatrical sequels I've seen, like Highlander 2, Highlander 2 had Michael Ironside, who's actually a very good actor, playing the main bad guy in that movie. But it's like, they looked at, Kurgan in this movie, and, and instead of, having the right mix of, hamminess and scariness, they just went all out on him with Michael Ironside. And like I said, Michael Ironside's usually a good actor, but yeah, his work in Highlander 2 was not one of his finer moments. And you had Mario Van Peebles playing the bad guy in Highlander 3, which the best that can be said about Highlander 3 is at least it's not Highlander 2. And it's kind of the same thing about, Mario Van Peebles as the bad guy in Highlander 3. At least he's not Michael Ironside in Highlander 2. So, and it's like with Michael Ironside, they tried to, go all in on the hamminess that, Kurgan had in the first one, but they forgot to actually make him menacing, because Kurgan had that right mixture of hamminess and, menacing, and then with Mario Van Peebles, it's like, I'm not going to say he was menacing, but at the very least they toned down the hamminess, but it was still mostly ham. Whereas Clancy Brown had just the right mix. He was entertaining and terrifying. Like when he's after someone, look out. And so you have these scenes where he's having a blast and everything, but at the same time it's like you're entertained by it, but you're terrified by him at the same time. Like the scene where he's towards a climax where he's driving a billion miles an hour the wrong way down the street and just causing all sorts of havoc. It's a terrifying situation, but because we're locked in with him and it's like we're seeing things through his eyes, we understand the chaotic thrill that comes from this, and so it's a very strange effect. So Clancy Brown, though, another scene. There's a scene towards it's like in the last towards the last act of the movie where he and Connor meet in a church, and well, let's just say that Connor finds out something tragic that happened a long time ago that he didn't even know about, and Kurgan realizes that Connor never knew until now, and just the intensity of the moment between both actors is very well done. But there's a bit where because they're in a church and the nature of of the conversation, it's very disturbing, and it's scaring a lot of the people away. And this priest comes up to him and he's talking to Kurgan and he's saying, people are trying to pray here, you're disturbing them. And so Kurgan, and he sort of kicks his feet up and he's all like, also the priest was saying, this is a house of God, people are trying to pray here, you're disturbing them. And so Kurgan, he's all like, this God, he cares for these weakling mortals or something along those lines. And so the priest is like, yes, he died for our sins. And so then the Kurgan, he's just all like, that will be his undoing. And right after that, he sort of taunts the priest by patting the guy on the face and saying, Father, forgive me, and licks the guy's hand, freaking the guy out. And then before he leaves the church, he's all like, I have something to say. It's better to burn out than to fade away. And apparently a lot of that was improvised on Clancy Brown's part. And I'm talking about it, but if you watch the movie and you watch that part, you're like, sacrilegious as hell, but man, badass villain right there. So yeah, Clancy Brown, this was definitely a career best for him. Also, Sean Connery in his supporting role, while his stuff is definitely in the flashback scenes of the movie, Sean Connery just kills it as Ramirez. Because he was already an awesome actor, and he could play just about anything in his sleep, I'm sure. But he made me believe that he was an immortal. That he was 1,000 years old or however old he was. But at the same time, I like the fact that while yes, he's aware that eventually he's more than likely going to have to fight someone he considers his friend. He is trying to give budding immortals, a fighting chance to make it to the gathering, as opposed to just going around slicing their heads off like the Kurgan does, or other evil immortals. And so, Sean Connery's presence was more than welcome, and he and Christopher Lambert, I thought, played very well off of one another. And also, I like how let's see, the actress, I think her name's Betty Edney. She played Connor's wife, Heather. She did really good too in the part that she had, in the sense that, she plays a very loving wife of Connor, and she gets along really well with Ramirez and what have you, and so it's like there was a little bit of humanity there, both with the mortal side of things and the immortal side. And so there's definitely a sense of tragedy in terms of what happens to the characters, or we feel the tragedy of what happens to the characters when Kurgan comes across them. But at the same time, though, it sort of adds to that feeling of these are people that we care about, and so. So yeah, all in all, just a really cool movie. It's like it's got a fascinating story. It's got good acting and memorable characters. A very believable environment, whether it's the Scottish Highlands or the gritty urban hell of 80s New York City. A fantastic soundtrack, and great camera work. And that's another thing. Sorry, the camera work in this movie is just amazing. And whether it be like, say, perspective shots or aerial camera shots, which at the beginning of the movie there's an amazing aerial shot where because the movie, it starts off where there's this at Madison Square Garden, this wrestling match, and Connor MacLeod, you find him in the audience, but before you get to him, though, it's like the camera, it sort of just pans over the arena and zooms over the crowd, and it's like we're seeing things from a bird's eye view almost, and it's a really fascinating shot, and then it gradually zooms into the seats, and there we see Connor just sitting in the shadows, while all these camera lights are going off and what have you. And it's an amazing shot. And so, I mean, it's just, there's so much about this movie that's awesome. Also, I was going to say, I mean, there are some familiar faces in supporting roles or bit parts. I mean, you have Hugh Quarshie, who I mentioned played Castigear, a fellow immortal that was a friend of Connor's. Hugh Quarshie, he was in the movie Nightbreed, as well as Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And he was, I believe he was like the main bodyguard of Natalie Portman's character. And then you have James Cosmo as, one of Connor MacLeod's kinsmen. He was, I think his name was Angus, but he was like the one guy who was, trying to keep, the village from killing Connor, because he didn't die, because he healed and everything. And he's the guy who kept his clan from, burning Connor and banished him instead. But he makes a very, strong impression in the brief amount of time that he has. But James Cosmo, he was in the movie Trainspotting as Ewan McGregor's father, or Ewan McGregor's character's father, as well as he had a supporting part in Game of Thrones. He was one of the leaders of the Night's Watch, or I think is it Night's Watch or Night Watch? If you're a Game of Thrones fan, let me know if it's Night's Watch or Night Watch. But anyway, yeah. So you got some familiar faces here too. So along with the main actors, but I'm going to go ahead and give Highlander 5 out of 5 stars. This was a great movie, and in terms of, say, the theatrical sequels, well, there should have been only one. There should have been only one Highlander. The TV show, okay, we might be able to give that one a pass, and maybe the animated movie, which was in anime, which was actually pretty good. I think it was called Highlander Vengeance or something like that. But okay, but that was like its own continuity, that kind of thing. It wasn't tied to this movie. But in terms of stuff that's directly tied to this movie, either they should have done away with the sequels altogether and just kept it this one, or they should have just said, okay, we got the movie and we got the TV show. That's what they should have done. But then again, it's been a long time since I've seen the TV show, and I was a little kid. I only saw parts of it, so I can't honestly say whether it was good or not, but I do know that it has a huge following. So, but yeah, so as far as the special features and everything, there was like a ton of stuff on here. There's a really good commentary track with Russell Mulcahy, which is a solo commentary track. There's also one where where he and some of the producers are talking about the movie as well. I haven't listened to that one yet, but there's also several making of documentaries on here, as well as a documentary that explores the legacy of the Highlander series. And there's also a really cool interview with Clancy Brown, where he talks about his time working on the movie and what it was like playing such an iconic character of Kurgan. And then you have you've got all these other people who were involved in the movie, like Christopher Lambert, talking about their time on the movie as well. And so, I mean, all in all, it's like, if you're a fan of the movie, I mean, get the movie regardless, but this is definitely a good presentation of it. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. And y'all take care. Goodbye. And remember, there can be only one.